Hi, everyone. Here we are again. I know we usually have the little lag. I've gotten better at being aware of that. So we are going to get started. Welcome back, and to those who haven't joined in the last couple of weeks, welcome. This is a community live stream. Come to your senses and find the story. I actually found my sign that I made for this. I made it the first week and completely forgot to show it to everybody because it was my first time doing the live stream, and I was very nervous and still sort of am a little bit because this whole way of communicating and working with people is still really new for me. And as I said to someone recently, it's definitely not in my bones. I'd much prefer being in my classroom or in our classroom, depending on what school I'm at, depending on whether I'm, as I said, when I was talking to, no, when I was giving a little bit of the bio the first week, I was saying I teach in a variety of different places, but I do really love being in person with people. We can't have that right now, so this is what we are. This is where we're going to land, and we are going to do our best, and hopefully not only make the best of it, but maybe in the process discover some things about ourselves and about the way we learn and about the way we communicate and sort of retain information and discover things along the way. So that's what I'm hoping for. So again, welcome back. What we're going to do, this is about a 30-minute session. You're not necessarily, I mean, hopefully you have a notebook and a pen, or well, obviously you have your computer in front of you, maybe your phone. There'll be opportunities to scratch out some ideas and thoughts. There won't necessarily be long stretches of timed writing. This is really just an opportunity to share some thoughts about how coming to your senses, how being in touch with your senses, and thinking about the way that your senses uh, can can feed writing. And by writing, I mean all kinds of writing. It doesn't have to be writing that you intend to publish. It could be journal writing. It could be writing a letter. It could be a short story that you're working on. It could be the start of your novel or maybe the end of your novel. It really is any kind of writing. So it's really just about thinking a little more about how sensual experiences do have the capacity to feed our creative life and our creative process and practice. So, a couple of things before we jump into some points that I want to make along the way, and hopefully share with you ideas and resources and things that are, that I've discovered this week that have kind of fed my way of thinking about not only my own creative practice, but also to some degree my practice of just pushing through this time that, again, as I said earlier, is just very different from what we're used to. So I'd like to start with, I think I ended on this last week, but I do want to start with just a point of gratitude. So anyone who is at home with, living with, or related to, or perhaps yourself, um, work at home with, living with, related to, or yourself, a first responder in some capacity. I do just want to say thank you. And I was, as I was writing notes for today, I thought, when we say first responder, I know we also, I think last week I had said, working on the front lines. I think that that's something that I'd like for people to, or at least I tell myself also, to stretch the definition of that a little bit. I have a few friends and family members who work in the healthcare industry, in the healthcare fields, and I try to check in with them all the time. But I was recently listening to something, and I read something about, and it's so true that there are times, I think, in all of this where we may all feel a little bit like we are stretched in many directions, and feeling like in some way, shape, or form, to some degree, we are first responders. So I just want to put a thank you out there, obviously, to the people who are working and doing the hard work, the essential work, so to speak, and working in the healthcare setting. And then also just a thank you to you as well for being here and for joining today. So we are going to begin with something that I think I may have mentioned this the first week, but there is this wonderful series called The Slowdown, and it is a poetry series that is hosted and I think originated through the poet Tracy K. Smith. And one of I mean, there's a lot of things that I like about it. I've been using that the work that's coming out of that series a lot in my classrooms. And I'm actually very grateful. One of my daughters sent me the information about this series many, many months ago. And since she sent it to me, I've been using the poems. They're just beautifully, I just think beautifully selected and curated poems. And then also there's this introduction that Tracy K. Smith, not always her, but oftentimes it's her, gives before the poem is offered, and that's quite beautiful too. And what I'm finding as I listen, because you can listen to these, and what I'm finding is that so many of them, as poetry does, so many of them touch on the notion of the senses. So I did just want to kind of start. I think last week I ended with I ran out of time as I always do, and I ended with this idea of letter writing. And I know that I'm pretty sure that that was something that I said we would start with and talk about today. So to just begin thinking about the value of letter writing, whether you've done any letter writing, since your pause began, whether you've done more of it or whether you've done less of it. I mean, people, and also, that I think sort of exists in different ways. I mean, I'm a letter writer, a physical letter writer. It's something that I really enjoy doing. But I think that for some people, it's, again, it's more of like a journal form, or for some people, it's really thinking hard and deep for a while about that email that you want to send. So I just want us to think about the value of letter writing, and then also think about how we might use more references to our senses in our letters. And I know oftentimes when I sit down to write a card to someone or a note, that I want to be, um, you know, to have more substance than just, I guess you'd say, like the typical thing that some people write, like a thinking of you, or, wondering how you are. Oftentimes, I will go back to a memory of that person, or maybe, I mean, in some cases, and I did this actually recently. Um, I was actually writing a note to someone who had lost a person in their lives. And I kind of started it with remembering an experience I had with that person. And so again, just wanting to sort of see these ideas of letter writing and memory intersect. And then what I'm suggesting, because of the topic of this session, this community live stream, I'm suggesting to begin to think about infusing the senses into that. It will liven the writing, whether you're writing a love letter or whether you're writing even an email. I mean, anything, I think, where um, you can roll back to something that people can relate to in that way. And and the idea of, obviously, our senses, I believe, are certainly relatable, even if people don't share precisely what you've experienced. I think that they are ways to engage, for sure. So I wanted to read something again, coming back to the Tracy K. Smith, and I don't know if I mentioned it before, but the series is called, I think I did, but the series is called The Slow Down. And you can find it on, obviously, Google it and find it. I think you can even subscribe, and you can get like a poem a day, which is really a beautiful way to begin the day. But recently I read a prompt that came out of that series, and I just want to share it with you. I certainly want to credit the artist. So this is from Mahogany Brown, and she's an activist. She's a poet, and an artist herself. And what she suggests, which I think is I just think is a great suggestion, and it made me think a lot about this idea of where we are now, where we think we want to be, where we were. So she says, in a time of social distancing, we're in a time of social distancing. Write a love letter to the life that you love, to the people who make your everyday possible, the bodega owner, the newspaper person, the barista. What does love in this time of your everydayness sound like? We are gifted with the ability to write the normal, and she puts that in quotes, or memory, and make it tangible. Write that love letter to yesterday and tomorrow. So part of what I hope can come out of this for people is the idea of receiving, even if it's just prompts or little suggestions, even if it's just a note that you jot down in your journal in the next 25 minutes, that can offer you a chance when you go back to your journal to have something to start with. And I think this is actually a really beautiful place to start. This idea of thinking about the lives we're all living now, and obviously they are varied, and not just because of the pandemic. They are varied anyway, but I think things are a little more pronounced for people now. And so this idea that Mahogany Brown is suggesting is to say, think about the everyday. Let's stay in the present for a moment and think about maybe who or what you're grateful for, who or what represents um, perhaps beauty, or perhaps something that brings you a degree of joy, let's say, and write a love letter to that person or thing. And what I'm suggesting, and she actually she suggests it here, what does it sound like? And I'm saying you can stretch that to use any of the senses. So I was recently saying that um, one of the things that has been kind of tricky for me. I was telling one of my closest friends this. We were catching up last week, and I was saying it's actually really tricky for me to be, let's say, like in the grocery store. And by the way, by no means am I suggesting that this is the worst thing to be experiencing now. I'm just offering it up as a way to think about, the really small things that we notice and pay attention to, or maybe don't pay attention to, and they kind of creep up and nudge us to think about it. But one thing is just this idea of, like, when I'm in a store, obviously everyone's wearing their masks, as we should be. It's just a little bit different. It's different to sort of get a sense of what obviously people's facial expressions are. And I'm learning about myself, and we're going to come back at some point in a little bit to this idea of what we're discovering. One thing I'm learning is how much I rely on that, and how much I actually appreciate being in touch with the expressions that people have, or the expressions of people around me. And so that's just I guess you could say that the idea of using sight and realizing something that about myself, and about not having that as much as I did before, and what that means. So she's talking about the everydayness of sound. So I just brought up this idea of something that I'm realizing and missing. I think that for some people, the sound, let's say, I mean, for people who were used to commuting every day on a subway, let's say, or for people who, were used to being out on the street and hearing certain sounds that are just not happening as much anymore. I mean, obviously it's endless the way you can think about it, but it's just, and I don't, I don't necessarily think it's, I mean, some people might say, well, why would you sit down and write something about missing, about what you're missing, or, why dwell in the sadness? I don't know that it's really that. I think in some ways, it's about recognizing what you do maybe miss, what you appreciate, what you're hungry for when things do resume in a way that we are hoping for. And then also, it's also an opportunity to wonder about what maybe you don't want to experience anymore, having had this, having gone through what we're going through. So I don't want to get off onto a tangent necessarily that is too far away from the idea of using senses to feed our creative practices. But I mean, I think it's almost inevitable, especially in what we're all couched in. So that's the first thing. I wanted to share the mahogany brown prompt, which I did, and also tell you a little bit about just, give a little shout out to that great literary series, The Slowdown. Um, I did recently, if you do go on to that, there's a wonderful poem that I recently used in a workshop last weekend called Bored, which is very, I think, it's very relevant to, some of the things that we're hearing or feeling, maybe ourselves or from the people around us, just the idea of boredom and what that feels like now, how we experience it, what does it mean, how do we flip it over and turn it around and do something with it. So that's something to think about. Okay, before we move on to the next little point to make, or maybe big point, hopefully a little bit of both. I do also want to mention that um, we do have the opportunity to have feedback and chat. So if there's anything at any point in time that you want to ask or that you want to offer, please just put that in the chat and I'll again start it. I'll just say, hello, everyone. Um, feel free to contribute or ask a question. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, so for those of you who are interested in a little more of an interactive thing, there's that too. Obviously, this isn't I was about to say traditional Zoom, which I find hilarious that I was about to say that because I don't even think anything could be traditional since I've only been using it for not even a couple of months, I guess. But in Zoom we can chat, and it's obviously a little bit different. For the YouTube, it is different from that, but we still can interact. And of course, as I mentioned the first week, if there's anybody who's interested in thinking more about writing, writing workshops or the writing instruction that we do at the Writing Institute, you can always find me through the website, of course. So the next thing I wanted to mention is just tell you a brief little story. Very serendipitously and in the way that things happen, I think in some of the best ways that things happen are through these kind of synchronicities and these connections or these meetings that you're not expecting. So I wound up being invited, and I was very grateful and honored to have that happen, to collaborate with a yoga studio and do like a yoga and writing workshop together, virtual, of course. I was obviously the writing instructor, not the yoga instructor, though I did do the yoga, and it was amazing. And we pulled together a really cool couple of hours, and I thought the collaboration went well. And one of the things that came out of that, a lot came out of that, and I found it to be a fascinating learning experience for me. I got to meet some new students that I had never met before, and a lot came out of it. But I just want to focus on probably just one or two. One of the things that came out of it is this idea of capturing. And, when we were doing our yoga poses, in between the writing, we were doing the yoga. The instructor, who was amazing and wonderful, kept saying, just really kind of capture, like, be in the moment, obviously be present, and try to capture precisely what you're feeling right now, like what your body feels like, what's going, what are you experiencing in the moment. And so I wanted to talk about that in relation to what the topic of this is, this, here we go again with my sign, come to your senses and find the story. I wanted to have you think about how we have this capacity to actually capture our recollections through the sensual experiences that can be a part of every day. So, and as I said from the beginning, part of what that affords us is the chance then, if we choose to go to a page at some point, whether it's your journal or if you're, a regular writer and you have your file of personal essays or your file of, ideas for the, first line ideas or short stories, whatever it is, but it does afford you, thinking about it like this, it does afford you the opportunity to capture some uh, recollections and even experiences in the present that are sensual ones that can take you back or can just take you somewhere having to do with what things taste like, smell like, feel like, what they sound like, um, and where that, where that lands for you, um, and what they look like. I knew I forgot one, and I can't believe I was spacing out there for a second. Um, and in fact, today, actually, I'll just show you this. I was looking at, because I mentioned in the first class that photographs can be a really, really great way to come back in touch with obviously a memory, but also to see the sense the references to the senses in a photograph. So this is, you can't really, it's not in color obviously, but I printed this out because this was a picture I looked at from when I was in Italy, actually on the in the program that we do at Sarah Lawrence in Italy, which we're not doing this summer, but hopefully we'll be back next year. And I was looking at this picture thinking about the various senses that surfaced as a result. And I did come up with 5 of them, even though I forgot the 5th a couple of minutes ago. And it was also just, it was kind of a nice little, getaway, 2-minute getaway from my desk. And I was able to kind of go back to the colors, the sounds, the sights. I mean, all of it in that moment. And I actually did jot a couple of notes down because I began to remember that time. So again, and I know I mentioned photographs, but photographs can be a great way to do it. So, but back to this idea of capturing. So when you're either looking at a photograph or when you're doing something on a walk, let's say, I was jotting down notes and I was thinking, when you're on a morning walk, or not necessarily a morning walk, or maybe an afternoon walk, evening walk, when you're cooking, other things that an active thing that you're doing, not necessarily physically active, but something where you're using your whole self, let's say. Where did the senses come in? And the point is, see if you can capture that. Like, don't just let that go fly away. Like, capture that and think about it. I know I recently I recently read, well, I've been reading, I really like Margaret Rankel's work. She writes about nature a lot. I mentioned this also last weekend in a workshop I did. And there've been, she's written about this, but also other people. And I actually had a student last semester who wrote about it too. And she taught me a lot. This idea of people are all of a sudden listening to the birds in ways that they didn't before. And I think it's fascinating. I also think it's kind of cool because it feels like it's this discovery. And I'm not saying that all of a sudden everyone's listening to birds and nobody did before. Maybe that's the way it sounded, but that's not what I meant. What I mean is that I think that there's a certain quiet that, you know, no matter where you're living or what your personal situation is, I think there is a certain quiet just by virtue of the fact that so much has stopped that was going before. So there's opportunity to hear things that we maybe weren't listening for, or just we weren't in tune, we weren't necessarily in tune, or it wasn't available to us just because of all the other things that we were listening to. So that is something, just again, with this idea of the word capture in mind, that is something that I think is relevant and valuable and can be a good help to getting some words on the page, some musings about sound, musings about nature, and about what we have available to us right there in the trees. I mean, and I know I talked about seasons in the first or second session, but obviously that's a really relevant ideas that certainly on the East Coast we have the change of seasons, and a lot of times the senses come into play um, when we think about that. So we did starting with the letters. We did capturing, using the word capture to get us moving. Get my notes here. I did also want to talk a little bit. I know the last couple of weeks and people did last week, and you don't necessarily have to, but I'm into this show and tell thing, and it's probably just me really getting amped up about like remembering what it's like to be a kid because anytime I have the opportunity to do that, I just like go right for it. So my show and tell for this week, I have three things of show and tell. I'm going to start with the idea of fabric because I want you to also see that as an opportunity to get, a little something written. So think about fabric and think about fabric that speaks to you and fabric that for whatever the reason, when I say that to you, like when I say what fabric speaks to you or what fabric kind of if I ask you what material or what fabric do you think is most sort of strong in your memory, or can you identify the easiest, or comes to mind? I mean, that alone matters. Write it down. I bring it up because I was recently I was pulling out a few excerpts from my book for another project. And I realized again, and this is not something I just realized now, it's come up before, but I realized that a lot of a lot of the references in my book, and my book is, for those who don't know, it's called Not for Nothing: Glimpses into a Jersey Girlhood, and they are glimpses into my childhood. And a lot of the references in those glimpses are to kind of soft, um, I guess plushy, I don't even know if that's a word, but like fabric that has a very soft feel to it. So I talk about rubbing my finger along corduroy pants. I talk about rubbing my hands along my mother's velour robe. For those of you who know what I mean, in the 70s, those velour zip up robes were like the rage. They were the hottest thing. I think at one point I talk about shag carpeting. I talk about the inside of my, and this is not something having to do with the error, but I talk about like the inside of our dog at the time, like, finding that really soft spot, like right on the inside of her stomach, or on the underside. So this idea of touch, obviously, is where I'm going with that. But I wanted to, my show and tell thing is this. So this is actually a blanket that my mother's mother knit, uh, crocheted. I'm not sure if I'm using those words incorrectly, but and every time I see a blanket like this, and on occasion I will see blankets like this, uh, it makes me think of her. And it's a very specific feeling when you have a blanket like this on you. It's definitely a specific kind of a feel, and it's got a certain type of sensation, I guess. So that's one fabric that brings me back and makes me think about my grandmother. And I could certainly, if I had to, or maybe I will, if I could write a little story about that and get something started. And let me just stop here and say that, I'm sure that there are people who listen to what I'm saying and think, really, where is any of this going to go? I mean, is any of this going to really land? Is any of this going to become a published piece? Is any of this going to become a short story or something that you can really do anything with? And my answer is, I don't know. But my second answer is, it could really be cool trying to just see what happens. And that's part of the process. That's part of the exploration. And on the good days, that's part of the magic. On the not so good days, it is also part of the agony. I won't lie. But that, I think, is what makes it, um, an opportunity to possibly discover something, and also to remember and to play around with details and small details. So the blanket was my first show and tell. I only have three today total. This next one is for those of you who, I don't know if you could. I hopefully you'll be able to see. This is just a little piece of rosemary. So I love rosemary and the smell. So this is actually, for me, this is a touch and smell, because I feel when I rub my hands up on it, it makes me think a lot about, it makes me think about the summer. I love to cook, but the first thing that comes to mind is I think about being in Italy and in a specific place actually where the rosemary grows like in big hedges. And I remember when we were there and I would early in the morning take walks and it was as if it was in the summer. So it was like the air was um it was just hot and it felt like for that reason alone, the smell of the rosemary was even more pronounced. So that makes me think um, of Italy, of a trip that I was on, and right there, there can be a story in that, a tale to tell, fiction, nonfiction, poetry. And the other thing to say is, just I mean, obviously, this is most people realize this, but you've had an experience. It's there in your past. It's in your, in a file somewhere in your mind and in your heart, hopefully, and in your spirit as well. But you can like take that back out and do something with it, and reimagine it again, or find something else about that experience that you didn't think about before. So that's kind of a cool thing. The third show and tell item I have is this, which isn't. This is the generic. This is the generic version of Vicks, but it doesn't matter because all you have to do is open it up, and I'm back in my childhood bedroom with a bad cough and my mother rubbing this on my chest. And I think I said this about Play-Doh a couple of, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, but the interesting thing for me is that things like this, which have sensual kind of value and ignite my senses and my memories from when I was a child, now as a parent, also ignite my memories and recollections of when I was putting this on the chest of my children because they were sick and had coughs. So that's kind of an interesting thing too. All right, I am coming toward the end, and as usual, I always run out of time. But I did want to. Well, I actually wanted to read. I'm going to end on this poem. And then next week we'll start. I have some ideas about where I want to start for next week. Of course, it involves bringing something else up into my office that was downstairs because it's another show and tell thing. But I would like to just share again with you a poem, an opportunity to have you think about senses, an opportunity to pass something to you that I feel like was passed to me, and this wasn't given to me personally. I actually came across it when I was looking through some of the poetry of one of my favorite writers. Her name is Ellen Bass, and I came across this poem that I'm going to read to you because it is I find it to be a really sensual poem, but it's also speaking to me in light of what we're experiencing. So I'm going to read this to you and then give a couple more little notes. If anybody wants to ask a question, you can type it in, and I can hope see that, and then we will finish up for today. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week. But this is called "Any Common Desolation" by Ellen Bass. My copy is very light, so hopefully I'll be able to read it. Any common desolation can be enough to make you look up at the yellowed leaves of the apple tree, the few that survived the rains and frost, shot with late afternoon sun. They glow a deep orange gold against a blue so sheer, a single bird would rip it like silk. You may have to break your heart, but it isn't nothing to know even one moment alive. The sound of an oar is in an oarlock or a ruminant animal tearing grass, the smell of grated ginger, the ruby neon of the liquor store sign, warm socks. You remember your mother, her precision, a ceremony as she gathered the white cotton, slipped it over your toes, drew up the heel, turned the cuff. A breath can uncoil as you walk across your muddy yard. The Big Dipper pouring night down over you and everything you dread, all you can't bear, dissolves, and like a needle slipped into your vein, that sudden rush of the world. I did not do that poem justice, so I would very much encourage you. I love that poem. I listened to it today, and obviously just read it to you now, and feel as though it's one that would, um, I feel as though it's one that will continue to speak to me. I definitely think it's a poem, a great example of a poem that, we can find sensuality and the senses in that. And I would encourage you to look up that poem, and maybe even as a prompt, print it out or read it to yourself, or listen to Ellen Bass read it on her, it's on her website. Ellen, I guess it's ellenbass.com. I think her name is spelled Bass, first name Ellen. And I would encourage you to look into that poem and find some of the sensual details that speak to you. If there aren't any in that specific poem, but another word or maybe a circumstance speaks to you, then use that as a prompt. So again, just to kind of repeat myself, it's about discovery and capturing things, and then, as we said last week or the week before, and as I feel like I say all the time in my classes, um, thinking about the meaning making that we can do with that, and how to, how do we make meaning of these things that we have the capacity to capture in our everyday life. That is it for today. Thank you again for joining us. I am still pretty new at this, but I'm really happy to know that some people might be deriving some kind of benefit, or getting some ideas, or maybe just, having a little bit of, their creative practice either enhanced, or, just having some generative energy flowing. I will see you next Tuesday, same time, same place. Thank you again to all of you who are doing good work, in whatever that means to you, in whatever way. We're hearing a lot about sticking together and doing this together. And I'll just leave you on this. I was on my walk today, and I was listening to something, and the phrase that stuck out for me was collective hope. So I know that we cannot be positive and hopeful every second of the day, or maybe we can, but I know that that's hard to be. But I did hear that, and I just heard that phrase, and it spoke to me, and I'll just leave you with that. Have a have a pleasant evening, and stay healthy. And thank you again for joining. Take care.